So one of the kind of traumatic experiences that you were part of in these walls, I understand, the 1994 earthquake. No, and I believe you were teaching then?
So I just want to back up. It wasn't 94. It was just a few years ago. It wasn't the big. It wasn't a.
Okay.
It wasn't a big earthquake.
Okay.
But it was one to shake the room. It was so about, I think it was 4 years ago, and it was on July 4th. Okay. The room was, I think it was July 4th because on holidays, usually the studio closes later in the day, so there's more people in the earlier classes. Mm-hmm. So I think there were probably 80 people in the room, 80 plus people in the room. And so we're this far away from each other, which creates a whole other wonderful energy. And I remember we had just gone to Downward Dog, and I think folks went into Child's Pose, and all of a sudden there was an earthquake. And I was up here, I was teaching, and all of a sudden all these heads popped up, and there was wide eyes, and there's an anticipation when that happens of, is it over? What's next? It can bring fear. And so the lights were swaying afterwards for several minutes afterwards, and there were a couple folks in the room who work for hospitals, and they quickly left just because they didn't know if they were needed. Right. So they quickly left, and then several folks, you could just see the room was not settled, and so the whole rest of the class, instead of balancing poses and things where people might already be shaken and not be able to really find their balance, we did a lot of low to the ground, which I learned from my teacher, from Gene Heilerman. Low to the ground, a lot of grounding work. It became less about what level the class was and more about bringing people back to center.
So then you were able, there's a large number of people here having just gone through a traumatic experience. You were the voice who was able to help them find a place of rest within. So we've collectively just been through a similar traumatic experience, the pandemic and being quarantined. And to a certain extent, the lights are still swinging, yes, with the Omicron or whatever, and yet we're teaching again. So how have you been able, how has this process been for you?
It's been a really interesting process to teach with the pandemic. Pre-pandemic, there were several teachers who did some work online, but a lot of us were in the studio primarily, myself included, and abruptly everything went online. And that's a whole different way of teaching. It's a whole different way of practicing. It's a completely different way of viewing students. Mm-hmm. So some folks are at home, most folks are at home, or wherever, a space they could practice, often it's their home. A lot of time cameras are off. A lot of times cameras are focused on their feet, or one can't see their whole physicality. And a great part of my teacher training was learning to observe. It was learning to observe the student, both what you see in their physicality, but also observing their energy. And that's a lot trickier in an online format, right, especially if one needs glasses like I do and I'm far away from the screen. Right. So teaching online, at first I was unsure how it was going to go. And then what I've come to realize is that it made me flex a different muscle, to learn to work a different muscle as a teacher. Mm-hmm. So yoga's tools are wide, and there are many, and we can focus on certain ones in certain situations. And sometimes those are the beneficial tools. And in other situations, we might pull out, like the earthquake we talked about, might pull out a different tool. Mm-hmm. And so I have found that there is still wonderful community online, but it changed how I teach in that forum.
Right.
which has then infused its way back. Some of the knowledge that I gained there has infused its way back into my in-person classes.
Oh, say more. Fascinating. Good. Okay.
Yeah, I mean, as a teacher, I'm observing different things on Zoom. I'm not observing anymore, even though it's harder to for me.
Right.
We're observing different things.
Right.
We're looking for different prompts within a student's practice.
Mm-hmm.
And so those prompts that I've now learned to see on Zoom, perhaps I never learned to see before in person. And so I look at it as my toolbox has gotten bigger and I've got more tools in it now.